Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Good evening, ambassadors, friends, colleagues, and welcome to Glucksman Ireland House at NYU. And of course, to Loretta, welcome home, as always. My name is Caroline Hafey, and I'm the Assistant Director here at Ireland House. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'll ask that you please silence any cell phones or electronic devices at this time. And please hold all questions. We're going to do a Q&A after we hear some conversation from the panel. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Kevin Kenny, our own director here at Ireland House, will moderate a conversation between former Ambassador Susan Elliott, former Congressman Bruce Morrison, and Dr. Bonnie Weir. Susan M. Elliott is an accomplished diplomat with an earned doctorate from Indiana University. During her 27-year diplomatic career, Ambassador Elliott has held a variety of leadership positions at the U.S. Department of State. During her foreign service career, Ambassador Elliott worked in a variety of overseas and Washington-based assignments. Her previous overseas assignments include Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in Moscow, Russia, Principal Officer in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Deputy Economic Counselor and Visa Section Chief in Athens, Greece. I'm going to get these right. Ambassador Elliott worked on the staff of former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice as a Deputy Executive Secretary and Director of the Executive Secretariat staff. And earlier in her career, she reported on conflicts in the countries of the former Soviet Union. She became President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy in August 2018, and we're delighted that she can join us this evening. Bruce Morrison is a former congressman from Connecticut, where I currently live as well. He is a member of the Democratic Party and an officer of the National Democratic Ethnic Coordinating Committee. In 1992, Bruce Morrison supported Bill Clinton's campaign by forming Irish Americans for Clinton-Gore, which recruited Clinton to support an activist agenda to assist in ending the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Clinton's pledges during the campaign became the basis of his work on the Irish peace process when in office. And in 2019, Morrison, alongside a number of other Irish American political and civil society figures, founded the bipartisan ad hoc committee to protect the Good Friday Agreement. He currently serves as co-chair of the committee alongside his fellow co-chair, Republican James Walsh. And in 2000, he founded the Morrison Public Affairs Group, a Bethesda, Maryland-based lobbying firm. The firm specializes in financial services, housing finance, and immigration policy. He also conducts an immigration law practice. Everybody up here is very busy. Dr. Bonnie Weir earned her PhD at the University of Chicago in 2012. She's a senior lecturer in political science at Yale University, research associate of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, and founding co-director of the program on peace and development at Yale. She is currently serving as Director of Undergraduate Studies for Ethics, Politics, and Economics. Dr. Weir's work focuses on political violence and post-conflict politics with an empirical concentration on Northern Ireland. She is currently working on survey experimental projects on sectarianism and voting behavior, as well as minority rights. She recently wrote about the legacy of violence and division in Northern Ireland in Brexit and a Border Town. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our own Loretta Brennan Glucksman, who will get us started with a few words. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Caroline. This is always so fun for me, and I'm very, very grateful and appreciative that you all indulge me so generously the way you do when we gather at this little place that is still chugging along after 30-some years. This is a unique opportunity, given the time that's in it. What a time to be associated in any way at all with Ireland, the UK, and peacemaking. And it centers on Ireland. And I love that. And I love the way the people that have put these celebrations together have, have focused on the role of women in Northern Ireland. I remember very early on when I went up there just as an ordinary person and got to know these phenomenal women. Baroness May Blood, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and boy, is she missed. and she is pissed off that she's not there. And I'm sure she's making that very clear to anyone who will listen up there. So many that I won't make the awful mistake of naming and leaving out two very important people, but I'm thrilled that I will be able to be there physically. Just as I am thrilled to be here tonight, this is a very apropos and very important discussion in our own little place, and I'm deeply grateful. You heard Caroline give those amazing bios. These are not layabout people. These are people that are doing important things every day, and I am honored that they're here, and I'm even more honored that I have been their friend, or they more correctly have been my friend over the years, especially Bruce. We go back a good ways, Senator, Congressman, sorry. But you started so much that is now bearing fruit. So thank you for being here. Very dichotomous apology from Ted Smyth, who is here in spirit, but his body is in Ireland, and he's already been all over the news. And but his heart is here. He's very grateful that all of you, especially the distinguished panel and our guests, are here. So I'll put it back to the man of the hour who put it all together, our own director, Professor Kevin Kenny.
Thank you so much, Loretta. Everybody can hear me? Good. So before we begin, Loretta, I'm going to embarrass you slightly. I just want to take this moment to register our gratitude to you for everything you've done to bring peace on the island. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. It's been a hectic week. We've pulled it together. It's wonderful to have Bruce Morrison, Susan Elliott, and Bonnie Weir. We're Irish. We love to talk. We're a university. We love to talk through the issues. So tonight is going to be conversational. Our panelists, in the order seated, starting with Bruce, have agreed to make relatively brief comments on different aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, ranging from strategy, past and present, to some more forward-looking reflections on the role of peacemakers and women today, to the importance of sectarianism in the province today. I may then make one or two comments, depending on what I hear. We're honoured to have Ambassador Fergal Smyth, Ireland's ambassador to the UN, with us. I will call on Fergal to make a few comments. Welcome, Fergal. And then it's over to us. I think we're going to have a very meaningful and important conversation this evening. So without further ado, Bruce.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the invitation to be here. It is a joy to be with Loretta, especially, and I know all that Loretta and Lou have done for this place and for Ireland over many years, and Loretta never stops doing good things for Ireland. So, Loretta, it's great to be with you. The 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement is an occasion for many different things to happen and many things to be discussed. And one could talk. I promise to be brief. That's not my style, but I'll do the best I can. So I'd like to sort of focus in on one idea, and that idea is strategy. Because I think that to understand how there became a Good Friday Agreement, it's important to understand who had strategies, what kind of strategies were there, and how was that important in the result. And looking forward, because I think that one can be lost in celebrations of 25 years and lose sight of the future, because the Good Friday Agreement is far from unfinished business. There are many things that are imperfect and many other things that have not really even been addressed. My involvement with this issue really came to a head in 1987 when I took a trip to Ireland, and including Northern Ireland, met a variety of people, including my first meeting with Gerry Adams, and got a perspective on the possibility of peacemaking. And that perspective was that there needed to be an outside influence that would sort of break the bonds that had caused people to think that there was one way to get it done, and that way never seemed to work. Now, what happened? Well, lots of things happened, but the most important thing that happened for me was that years before I went to law school with Bill Clinton. And that opened a door that not too many people had opened when he chose to run for president, and an opportunity to talk to him about what he could do as president related to the situation in Northern Ireland, to deal with the troubles. And it was not just me, there was a group of people who worked on this, but the important point was we had a strategy. This was not some kind of accident. This was not just a, talk in the middle of the night and say, hey, Bill, would you do this? This was if Clinton could get engaged as a candidate, and if Clinton could be elected president, then Bill Clinton could be that outside influence, that new voice that would bring a different perspective to something that everybody acknowledged needed to be addressed, but nobody quite knew how to get it addressed in an effective way. We were successful. We were successful because we picked the right horse in terms of who became president, but we picked the right horse in another way too. Bill Clinton is a remarkable human being. He has his flaws like everybody, but he has an encompassing mind, and he has a strategic way of thinking about problems. And he saw the possibilities. He saw the possibilities of getting Irish Americans to vote for him in 1992, and he freely admits that that was an important initial incentive to get involved. But as he tells the story about his daughter, Chelsea, writing her thesis on his work in the peace process, she said, you really wanted those Irish votes in the New York primary, but once you got engaged, you couldn't help but do the right thing. So that's really a story of somebody who grasped the nettle, who took a perspective that he was going to do something about this. And he was not going to be hidebound in the way that the U.S. had been for all of history, which was to have lots of Irish Americans, asking for something to be done, but always to defer to the British about what could and couldn't be done. And he, what did he do? Well, he set himself the task of being responsive to those people who were giving him suggestions about how he could change things. And the way he changed things was strategic. Number one, he was open to a big tent solution. He was willing to get everybody around the table and not exclude people who had been systematically excluded because of things that they had done or causes that they had embraced in the past. Because he correctly believed that a peace process does not get made among all the people at peace. The peace process requires bringing in people who have not been at peace and getting them to see the virtues of a democratic and political way forward. And he understood that from the beginning. And the second thing he understood was he was going to break some eggs. He was going to unsettle some people, and he was going to have to take political risks. Now, today, 25 years later, after the peace agreement, and we're talking 6 years before that these discussions went on, everybody's for the Good Friday Agreement and everybody thinks it was obvious that it would happen. That's not true. There was strategy. There was strategy of the people who worked Clinton for this. There was strategy by Clinton as president to take risks for peace. And there was a lot of strategy by Sinn Féin to move away from the armed struggle into politics. That didn't happen overnight. It was a long and hard process. But the people who led that process, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, they knew where they were going. I think they knew where they were going in 1972, but they certainly knew where they were going in 1986. And they forged a way forward. And the other person who saw the future in a way that may be underappreciated is John Hume, because for John Hume, broadening the nationalist constituency in the process was not good politics for him. It was very risky for him. But in 1988, he was negotiating with Gerry Adams for a platform for the nationalist community to put forward in a peace process. And had that never happened, and it took strategy both from Hume and from Adams for that to happen. Had that not happened, we wouldn't be celebrating the Good Friday Agreement. So where does that, for me, leave us today? I don't think there's a lot of strategy around as we celebrate 25 years. We don't have a Stormont Assembly, which means we don't have a meaningful government in Northern Ireland. What kind of a government can just sort of stop working and take its time and come back together when everybody can agree on something they don't even define clearly as what it is they're seeking? So how can we change our sense of what a government, a devolved government in Northern Ireland is? It certainly isn't what we have in Stormont. This is far too fragile. When a government falls in a parliamentary country, you have elections and a new government comes in. And the same people can't constantly veto the ability to have a government, whether that's Sinn Féin or DUP or somebody else. So there needs to be a strategy for making whatever changes are necessary in order to get the government to function. Secondly, there needs to be a strategy about the economy in Northern Ireland, and it can't just be foreign direct investment. This is an economy that has half the per capita GDP of the Republic. This is a basket case as far as one would compare it to other functioning first world locations. And that has to change. And that has to change in a variety of ways. And there needs to be an economic development strategy that is bottom up in terms of education, bottom up in terms of economic investment from the UK and from Ireland, and in terms of the way in which the educational system functions for all the people in Northern Ireland. Third level free education in the Republic changed Ireland totally. And that same kind of impetus has to occur in the North. So from my perspective, we got here by strategy. We didn't get here by accident. We will not get to the future by just reading and rereading the Good Friday Agreement. We need a strategy to address the main problems that we have. Political, in terms of sectarian division and the inability to get our government to function, and economic, in terms of a lack of a real economic development strategy that is more than just asking foreign companies to please invest money. So I hope that the celebration gives rise to contemplation, and that the contemplation is about a strategy, and we can sign people up to a strategy rather than just sign people up to sit in a hall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. As you can see, we already have a lot to talk about, but I will turn it over now to...
Well, and I'd like to kind of build on what Bruce has said about the strategy, but, you know, sitting here looking at Loretta, and one thing probably many of you don't know is that she's going to be honored by Queen's University by the Chancellor Hillary Rodham Clinton as one of 25 women who were significant participants and leaders in getting the peace process not only going but maintaining it. And I think one of the things, if you can look on Queen's University online to see the names of the women, but those women were Americans. They're people from Northern Ireland. They're people from the Republic of Ireland. And so it's a variety of women. There are people like May Blood, as she mentioned, Monica McWilliams. They're women who, I think, as Bruce said, President Clinton and Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, I was going to say, and their counterpart in the UK, and whatever his name was, Tony Blair. But anyway, that's a senior moment. But they provided the leadership, but really it was the people who were on the ground, like women in the Women's Coalition, people who got together and said, look, our leaders aren't providing for us what we need, and we need to have a seat at the table, which they didn't have at the time. But let's fast forward 25 years and say, who's going to help make that strategy that Bruce mentioned for the future? And I think it really can't just be the politicians, because as he mentioned, Stormont isn't working. So I think what needs to be done, and what I've done in the current job that I have been talking with a lot of people, I was U.S. Consul General. The organization I work for has been involved in the peace process, since 1994. We hosted the first conference that brought Jerry Adams to the U.S. to begin the discussions, and Bruce, of course, was involved in that. But we need to really think of how we're going to engage women, and how are we going to engage the next generation. And recently had a group of women leaders who are 20-something, 30-something, who work from both communities, both nationalist and from unionist communities. And a couple of things that they said, and Bruce mentioned those, and so they do need to be part of a strategy, are, they're looking for economic development, because a lot of people feel that the only way to be successful, if you're a young person in Northern Ireland, a lot of times is to leave and look for jobs other places. So there need to be opportunities created, and I think Bruce is right. While the U.S. can help in other countries to do foreign direct investment, there has to be more, than that. But I think education is a big part of it as well. That was another thing that young people have said, that they don't really feel that the educational system represents them. And not only does it not represent them, but depending on what school you go to, you may not even learn about the Good Friday Agreement. So the curricula are different. According to what I've been told, the curriculum are different in different schools, and of course then there are divisions, among who goes to what school, and how does that create a common bond among the next generation of people? Because identity has always been an issue. Do you want to be Irish? Do you want to be British? But from a lot of the statistics and things that I've read recently, Katie Hayward, who's a professor at Queen's University, just did a study and said that the majority of young people, many of them who were born after the Troubles, they don't want to be Irish or green. They want their, for lack of a better word, Northern Irish, whether you're from, whether you see yourself as British or Irish, they want to have a good place to live with opportunities for their children, with good education. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are important perhaps for us to work on as the three countries, the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and the US, is like, how can we help? Obviously the people have to make their own decision, but how can we help them to be able to come together and include these younger voices, and a lot of them female voices, in making the strategy that Bruce so eloquently outlined. And I think if you look at, I would tell you that there are some women in politics in Northern Ireland, but not that many. And I've talked to women politicians, and I would suggest that you look at the women political leaders and check out their Twitter feeds and see the kinds of things, the kinds of threats that they get from people, and the kinds of misogynist, comments that are made for them. And And so, in fact, one leader said to me, those threats are scarier than somebody putting a bomb in my constituency office. Why? Because at least if there's a bomb, there might be CCTV, the police can arrest the person. But if someone, threatens me or my family online, it's very difficult for me to know who it was and, is it real or isn't it real? So I just bring this up as kind of what I've heard from young people and from women saying in Northern Ireland today. And so I think one of the things that perhaps we can do, as Americans, is look for ways to, to help people across community and to ensure that, women have a voice at the table because, well, I believe, if the Women's Coalition hadn't had a voice at the table, nothing against, the leaders, but they really helped make the difference on bringing things together. And, if you don't want people to join paramilitary groups, if you don't want people to resort to things that are not constructive, you need to provide them with opportunities to make them feel that they haven't been left behind. So that's, I'm really looking forward to next week. I'm looking forward to seeing Loretta get her award, but then I'm also looking forward to engaging with a lot of the, the young, especially the young women that I've become involved with, to see how we can work together. Because for me, as someone who's a former U.S. government employee, talking with people in the community and saying, okay, I don't have a direct line to Joe Biden. I wish I did, but we can help people to make strategies to figure out the way they're going to move forward, so that the next 25 years can be better than the first 25 years. And to be honest, I'm part of Bruce's group, the ad hoc committee to preserve the Good Friday Agreement. I think most people say that the Good Friday Agreement shouldn't be thrown out the window, but it probably, as Bruce mentioned, they need to look for ways to perhaps revise and make sure that when there's a government that, it doesn't fall, but you have another election. You could be like Israel. Look at Israel. They have elections all the time. Or even if you're like the Irish or the UK Parliament, when people are elected, it isn't based on, how many votes you got, but the Parliament comes together and the parties choose their leaders. So anyway, I'm optimistic. Someone asked me. I was interviewed by Sky News last week about the Biden visit, and they asked me all kinds of doom and gloom questions, really. And
it was Sky News.
Yeah. Anyway, but now they want to interview me again, but I didn't buy into their doom and gloom. So I said I'm optimistic for the future of Northern Ireland. I've lived there. I was U.S. Consul General. I have a lot of good friends. I'm looking forward to being there next week. And I think, the engagement of our three countries, but I really think, what we need to focus on is looking at the next generation and help them to feel empowered and help them to feel that they can run for political office and that their representatives represent them and actually work for them. So.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to discuss a little bit of the doom and gloom. But first, it's a real privilege to be here at Ireland House and to be with figures who were absolutely central to driving the peace process forward at a time when a conflict seemed absolutely intractable. Loretta, Bruce, Fergal, and Susan. It's great to be here. As both Bruce and Susan have remarked, there are some enduring challenges to the peace process in Northern Ireland, and I got really curious about one aspect of the challenges there, sectarianism. People often remark that elections in Northern Ireland, they will quip that they're little more than sectarian headcounts. And I was curious to what extent these voting patterns that we see at the aggregate level, which is really like one block of orange and one block of green with a little bit of other in between, which may be growing, and that's great. But to what extent is that really true? Like, how bad is sectarianism in Northern Ireland a quarter century after the Good Friday Agreement? But the thing is, it's really tricky to ask people about, are you sectarian? You know, like people don't want to say yes to that question. They probably don't even want to say yes to themselves if they are indeed sectarian. So I had to think of a kind of a tricky research design in order to try to trick people into revealing, do they have sectarian preferences? And there's a way to do it with randomizing election scenarios that respondents see. And when you remove or change just one aspect of a scenario, its presence or absence will tell you something different about the way that somebody responded, and therefore you're able to figure out what's the effect of that one thing that you took out or that you added. So that's what we did over the course of 3 waves in Northern Ireland with representative samples of over 3,000 people. And I'll just talk a tiny bit about some of the initial findings. First of all, Northern Ireland, yes, people have sectarian preferences there. So in a contest between a unionist and a nationalist, all else being equal, around 90% of Protestants and 90% of Catholics, and we in the 3rd wave focused on Protestants and Catholics, not people who identified as other. As Susan, I think, alluded to, that group is growing. But right now, the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland identify as either coming from a Catholic background or Protestant background. So we focused on them. Around 90% of both, all else being equal, would prefer a candidate coming from their own community background. We know that Northern Ireland is a sectarian place because we see it not only in voting patterns, but we see it also in murals, in curb paintings, in marches, in bonfires, from anywhere from education to housing to the dysfunctional assembly and executive. And we also see it in the continued existence of Republican armed groups and loyalist paramilitaries that still hold sway in way too large of areas. And then, as I summarized just now, we see it also in people's political preferences, everyday political preferences. But then that raises some disturbing questions about democratic accountability and about the chances for political moderation. In a place, and I'm sure we're all familiar with political polarization, in a place that's incredibly divided, how are you going to hold somebody accountable if you're really loath to vote for the other guy if your guy does something wrong? So we tested to figure out, okay, let's pretend that this guy does something wrong. Let's see how people react. And the results were actually incredibly surprising. There were huge drops in support for both nationalist and unionist candidates from their respective constituencies when they were investigated, when we said this candidate was investigated for mismanagement of government resources. So somebody's inept or corrupt, their support drops markedly. It drops even more if the candidate suggests that his supporters go out and violently disrupt an opposition campaign or campaign rally. So flirting with violence is also really electorally self-defeating in Northern Ireland. That's great. Another great thing that we found is, well, what's the effect of if a candidate, let's say there's a unionist and then there's a Catholic that stands up and says, I'm running for office and my background shouldn't matter in politics, and the question of United Ireland or United Kingdom is not the most important thing right now. Support for that candidate is absolutely through the roof. And in a contest between a designated candidate and a non-sectarian candidate, all else being equal, the non-sectarian candidate wins, and usually by a vote share of anywhere between 13 and 15%. So that's wonderful. That means there's a hidden consensus of sorts in Northern Ireland against bad governance, against violence, in favor of more unifying politics. And there are indeed plausible chances for political accountability and moderation. So why do we see these big orange and green blocks in government? And why do we see an executive that's unable to form? Aside from the fact that at a baseline, people do still express some, what you call them, sectarian preferences for people from their own community. What's the real big problem is expectations that everybody has of everybody else, including others from their own community. That at election time, and if candidates do something wrong, that if they're corrupt, if they encourage violence, if it seems as if they're bad candidates, that others are not going to punish them. Everybody is going to display incredible amounts of sectarian loyalty. So you might want to go and punish your preferred candidate who mismanages government resources. But the fact that you're certain that the other side is not going to do the same thing drives you back into that polarized division that we see replicated again and again at elections. And if you look at vote shares over time in Northern Ireland, they really haven't changed that much since 1973, back at the height of the conflict. So there are indications that Alliance is building support. For what that's worth, if that's a signal of a desire for more unifying politics, that's great. The question is, why can't they expand their mandate? Why can't there be more unifying politics? Why isn't there more political accountability in moderation in Northern Ireland? And it's really this trap of expectations that everybody has of each other, even of their own community, that this is the way that everybody votes. And so you treat into these corners around the time of elections. So for as much as that's doom and gloom, we have found that underneath there are those desires. And so I think if we brought in some strategy and probably some risk taking, that might be two different phenomena that could be fostered in the future in Northern Ireland. So there's reason to hope 25 years after the agreement.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to offer two comments rather than posing questions to the panelists, because I really want to turn this into a conversation. I'm going to offer two comments that I think touch on all three presentations, and then I will turn it over to Ambassador Smyth and we'll be passing a mic. You can remain seated if you wish, and then we'll open it up. So let me just add these to the mix, and maybe they'll come up in conversation. As I reflect here in Ireland House on some of the most memorable events that we've done, and I was mentioning we have an event every Thursday evening, two that I recall. One is pre-pandemic. We hosted the annual meeting of the Scotch-Irish Historical Society in this building, and to us that was the most natural thing to do. To them it was an enormous gesture of goodwill. And I remember that moment so vividly, and it spilled out through the weekend. Post-pandemic, quite recently, speaking of female leadership, we had Tina Black, the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Sinn Féin party, in this building with Andrew Elliott, the head of the Northern Ireland Bureau. And they were here in town and in the United States as part of the initiative. Belfast is a UNESCO City of Music, and the initiative was to win the Fleadh Cheoil, the national festival for Belfast. On that day, it really sticks in my mind, I heard the same phrase twice, once from Tina and once randomly later that afternoon, that there is a generation in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, under the age of 25, nearly all of whom have not heard a bomb go off or have not seen a gun. And the question was, what's the messaging to them? Are they getting the messaging and the conversation that they, as senior leaders and as people who lived through the conflict, had? And this I think is very germane to Bonnie's distinction, as I'm hearing it, between the reality of sectarianism, but how that is amplified by expectation. So it's ramped up by expectation. So what is the messaging to that upcoming generation? This, I think, is connected in some ways to my second question that has to do with strategy and how, Susan, you linked it to Bruce's vision as well. The notion, Bruce, of the external influence, and the word Brexit is going to come up in the conversation at some point this evening. We'll sit here until it does. Well, it just has. So I wonder, and again, I won't ask the panel to answer this so much as it may recur in conversation. The European context, obviously, it's changed, but the complications there, and quite where we are on that now, then the guarantee of a border poll, the threat of the threat of an external impediment. Is there an external impediment to the guarantee of a poll in the agreement? Is that impediment Brexit? Does that change the rules of consent for the unionist community? And these are this is not doom and gloom so much as a question I'd love to hear more on. So I would just throw those two comments into the mix. The question really is, for the external influence, is the external influence changing with the European context? That's part of the question. And Fergal, I'll turn it right over to you on that basis.
Okay, there's a lot there. I might stand up.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Just to introduce myself, I'm Fergal Myton, currently Irish Ambassador to the UN since last May. Before that, I spent a lot of my career, I going back to 1990, working on Northern Ireland issues. I started my career in 1990 working for the Department of Foreign Affairs, working for the International Fund for Ireland. Then took a wee bit of a break, went off and did other things in the department. But when George Mitchell said in 1998 on Good Friday, we've reached agreement, now the hard work begins, I didn't know he was speaking to me and generations of colleagues who were involved in the implementation phase. And that was huge, because the Good Friday Agreement is a beautiful document. It's 36 pages, comprehensive it isn't. It sets out values, it sets out principles, and then it sets out a work programme. So in many ways I was involved in the Patent Commission, implementing policing reform, criminal justice reform, normalisation, demilitarisation, waves and waves, and very often then being involved in negotiations, political instability, putting it all back together again. I was at St Andrews when the breakthrough came between Sinn Féin and the DUP, and most recently I was working with the Irish government to get the institutions back together again, and after 3 years we succeeded in 2020 with the New Decade, New Deal approach. We asked the historian to bring together in one document, one book, all the British-Irish agreements, all the Northern Ireland-related agreements from 1972, from Sunningdale all the way through to New Decade, New Approach. And we were staggered to find that, you had Sunningdale 1972, Anglo-Irish Agreement 1985. Again, another US success in terms of President Reagan's involvement. Margaret Thatcher would not have signed that agreement without the persuasion and persuasive powers of President Reagan. And then we sweep into the 90s and the work that Bruce spoke about, that very, quiet, almost secretive engagement in 1987 bore fruition with the Downing Street Declaration between the British and Irish governments, all the way through then to 1998, 25 years ago. And after 1998, after the Good Friday Agreement, we've had 29 individual agreements, joint statements, implementation documents. So that's the work of implementation. And I think if there's any lesson we've learned, and it's a lesson we've shared with other peace processes, including Colombia, East Timor, etc., it's that hard work of implementation, never giving up, never saying mission accomplished, job done, we go away. Because if the conflict has deep, deep roots, as it has in Northern Ireland, if it's been particularly divisive, bloody, polarising, then the agreement is really only the start of it. And I think that's a really, really important point. And that work goes on. And I think I was at the celebration, the 10th anniversary in Belfast, the 20th anniversary. Now we're at 25. I think it's really important that we acknowledge and honour the generation that were involved, but now we also start looking ahead, as you said, and Susan. It's really important that we now start hearing from young people, and we look at the generations that are yet to come in terms of political activism and implementation. In terms of Northern Ireland itself, you can be glass half full, glass half empty. For those of us who were working in Northern Ireland in the 80s, 90s, those of you who may have visited, it was a militarised zone. It was a bitter, hard place, bitter, hard city, Belfast. You had military installations on the border. You had armed military in the streets. You had shootings, bombings, kidnappings, disappearances. You know, it was pretty, pretty grim. The Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, has been extraordinarily successful in ending the violence, as a perceived political tool. Only a handful of people in Northern Ireland think that violence is the way forward or can answer. And yes, they do exist, and we can come back to the reasons why, but in terms of the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, political strategy, political activism is the way forward. Whether that's to support the union with Britain, or whether to work for United Ireland, that phrase in the Good Friday Agreement, you know, working through exclusively democratic and peaceful means, that has succeeded. The huge swathes of implementation like policing reform had been extraordinarily successful. Not 100% successful, not perfect, but really, really successful. The military installations are gone. Prisoners were released. That was tough for many, many people, particularly victims of families of victims, but it was a necessary part of the process, and it was successful, and the vast, vast majority of ex-prisoners did not reoffend, but got involved in community work, political work, etc. So on any scale, and we do speak about this at the UN, you know, because the UN and the world need successful peace processes, and on any level, Northern Ireland peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, has been really successful on so many levels, and I think we work very closely with the Colombians, etc., another pretty successful peace process. Where do we stand, though? I spoke about the 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. The institutions were up and running. The 20th anniversary, they were not up and running. The 25th, they're not up and running. So we have a political instability problem. Some years back, Sinn Féin were causing blockage for their reasons, and they would see them as legitimate. Now it's DUP blocking, and for what they would see as their legitimate interests. But we have a problem. Can we tweak the Good Friday Agreement? I think that's a really important distinction I would make. The Good Friday Agreement is a set of values and principles that, in our view, as the Irish government, are absolutely foundational and cannot be changed. That's the principle of self-determination for the people of the island of Ireland alone, with no external impediment or interference. Secondly, the principle of consent is for the people of Northern Ireland themselves to decide their future. And if that's to bring about United Ireland, it's working in concert with the people in the south. Exclusively peaceful democratic means. These are hardwired and these are essential. There are mechanisms for review in the Good Friday Agreement, and we've used them on occasion. You can review the working of Stormont, you can review the working of the North-South ministerial bodies, you can review. So that element of review and change is there. It's a mechanism that can be used if the parties agree and if the governments are involved. But the fundamental values and principles were voted on by the people of Ireland, North and South. We changed their constitution, so they can't change. So I think it's important to draw a distinction between what can be changed, what should be changed, and what can be reviewed. I think while it's frustrating political instability, the absolute principles of the peace process were really inclusive. That big tent, bringing everybody around the table, as you spoke about, Bruce, and no unilateral measure. So the idea that the British government would try to unilaterally change the Good Friday Agreement is not on. For us, the idea that we would change the agreement without the say-so of the parties, that would also be really problematic, because these are fundamental cores of the process. So I think for us, yes, the mechanism for change of how the institutions operate and run is there, but it does need, you know, the same process that got us in the first place, inclusive, with the two governments working together and with US support. So that's where we stand. I hope on Brexit, I think we found a way through. I think it's no secret that the Irish government felt that the British government weren't sufficiently aware of the challenges of Brexit to the Good Friday Agreement, weren't sufficiently aware of the challenges to that very delicate compromise that is a Good Friday Agreement, about no border in the island of Ireland, about being British or Irish or both, the importance of the EU rule book for ensuring no hard border, for ensuring that people could work, travel, live north and south freely without any impediment. That was a core part of the Good Friday Agreement. Brexit I think it was somebody described it as turbulence in the force when it came to when it came to the Good Friday Agreement. I think we worked very closely. The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, we worked very closely with successive administrations in London, starting with Theresa May, to try and raise awareness of these issues. We believe Prime Minister May understood those issues. We believe the current Prime Minister understands those issues, and I think when the will is there, and when the British and Irish government work well together, then that's when the magic happens, and it can happen. And I think Prime Minister Sunak and the EU Commission have done a really important piece of work in trying to minimise the difficulties for the unionist community about the protocol. The protocol was to minimise the difficulties of Brexit for the nationalist community. So it's trying to strike that balance. We hope we're there. One party in Northern Ireland is still seeking clarification and still considering its position. It's important. I think the DUP leader was at the speech by President Biden yesterday and felt it was a measured speech and welcomed it. So there's lots of noise on Twitter, but the leader of unionism was there, and that was important, and was respectful and listened. And we hope that there's a space there where we can get the institutions back working. That's hugely important. We need the institutions back working in Belfast, but also North-South. I think one of our great disappointments in Dublin has been the North-South space, which is like the island of Ireland is about 6 million people at this stage, North-South. So that's not even Manhattan. Or certainly not the 5 boroughs. And myself and my wife, we drove our kids to Canada, and you're driving for hours and hours and hours, and you think, God, Ireland is so small. It's such a small island, and for whatever reason, and I'm not going to get into the politics and the history, but we turned our backs on each other, and we had a hard border, and it was desperate. It was such a waste of energy, resources, opportunity. And what we've tried to do in the Good Friday Agreement through the North-South bodies is to work together, the Stormont government, the Irish government in Dublin, for the betterment of everybody in the island of Ireland, particularly those living in border communities, and to unleash the potential of people in that area, and unleash the potential of a small island that can be amazing working together in whatever constitutional framework you want, but working together. So we've been really disappointed that the North-South strand 2 of the agreement hasn't been as effective as it might have been. Our current government has set up a shared islands unit and has put €500 million aside to just encourage North-South cooperation in education, health, all the spheres. It's not about replacing the Good Friday Agreement in any sense. It flows from the Good Friday Agreement, and it flows from Strand 2, and that's where we'd really like to see that potential. And that's where you get back to this economic potential of both parts of the island. It's hugely important. For us, Bonnie has spoken about the challenge of sectarianism. We have the two governments set up an independent monitoring commission just to assess the impact of residual paramilitarism. And they've done a really interesting report which mapped where there are still, small paramilitary groups, and where there have been, incidents and acts of violence, and they mirror absolutely areas of socioeconomic decline and deprivation. So for us, it's absolutely getting political stability back. It's about unleashing the potential of North-South and the island economy, and it's about addressing that socioeconomic deprivation in areas which is driving, residual paramilitarism and sectarianism, as you call it. So it's a heavy agenda, but when we look back to what Bruce was speaking to Bill Clinton about, and Jerry Adams and John Hume back in '87, it's eminently achievable and doable, and I think we can do that. So let's finish on a hopeful note in terms of my own presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. The floor is open. Rob Snyder.
Rob Snyder, Rutgers University. I'm concerned about the impact of the media on this situation with regard to building bridges, reinforcing divisions, and enforcing accountability and decision-making. And I'm thinking about the media collectively and individual media organizations. Can anyone speak about that?
The media is an amazing force in America in creating division, for sure. I'm not sure the people of Northern Ireland need the help. I mean, quite seriously, I think in contrast to sort of the Facebook, et cetera, Fox and MSNBC, however you want to look at it here, in seeming to drive people into camps, I think people in the North are in camps. And I'm not sure the media does anything but reflect that rather than create it. While I have the floor, I just want to say, Fergal, I think that was a spot-on summary of the Good Friday Agreement and what's fundamental and what's procedural. And I think that distinction's really, really important. And just to tell you what George Carlin said, some people say the glass is half empty, some say it's half full. I say the glass is too big.
Other thought, Loretta? Yeah. We'll bring you a mic, Loretta, for the or right next to you, actually. Yeah.
Sorry. Hello, Caroline.
Yeah.
I was absolutely transfixed by Fergal's comments, not just because, as all of you were there and you were in the trenches, but it reminds me to bring up something that I thought about when Bruce and I were talking, the centrality of Martin McGuinness. And at a time when, if only, remember the Chuckle Brothers?
I do. I was the consul general for the Chuckle Brothers.
It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
amazing
Yeah.
time, Susan.
Yeah.
And I don't see anyone like that on either side. The bringing together while maintaining the very dignified independence that Martin always insisted on. So he's in spirit, and I need to honor him because I thought he was a crucial aspect in the mix altogether.
Well, I would agree because I was there and had a lot of discussions with him. And, of course, that was what was portrayed in the media, that they were the Chuckle Brothers. So were they really doing anything? But I would credit, both sides had to make concessions, but I credit Martin because Martin decided that he would be deferential, at least these are things he told me, to Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley, he said he had never met him till 2007, and he said it was important that they didn't have to like each other, but they tried to find a way to work together. And just this goes along with maybe reform of the Good Friday Agreement, but the way the Stormont is set up, there's the first and the deputy first minister. Well, Ian Paisley always called Mark McGuinness his deputy. And he wasn't his deputy, they're co-equals. So, maybe that's something that needs to be thought about. That's a procedural thing that I think could be changed, that they're co-equals, they're not one to the other. And he even said to me, I'm doing that because I respect him as, someone like me who have made concessions and will try to come together. That was, and I think they genuinely liked each other. At least that's what Martin told me. I didn't have as many heart-to-heart discussions with Ian Paisley. But Martin really felt that, he liked Ian Paisley. He didn't like his politics. He didn't like, a lot of the things he said. But he liked kind of the relationship that they developed. And and I guess we could even look at this in our own Congress, is that there used to be people who had completely different points of view, but they'd go out and have a drink together, and there wasn't this, kind of animosity, and I was almost going to call it sectarianism, but it's definitely people are in different camps. But I would agree, Martin McGuinness. I was very sad when he passed away because he, to me, was a true leader, and he talked to a lot of people at the time I was there. Was also during when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and that was very unpopular. It was very unpopular that Tony Blair supported George Bush. And Martin McGuinness used to talk with people about, how do you resolve conflicts? And he said, what is leadership? And leadership really is, putting your differences aside and sitting down and trying to figure out a way forward. And I don't think there are very few people that I've ever met who had, as Loretta mentioned, his ability to try to say, okay, enough is enough, and I'm going to try to work on, dealing with with the other side. So
I think you've put your finger on something very special. Martin was as good a political activist and leader as the island of Ireland has seen in our lifetimes.
I agree.
He had the common touch. The reason he could put his own ego aside and deal with Ian Paisley like he would deal with his grandfather
Exactly.
was because he could do that, because he could see Ian Paisley as a person beyond his politics. And as people, I guess, know, or maybe don't know, he was invited by the family to come in Paisley's last moments to visit. I mean, unbelievable, the leader of the Derry IRA, having that relationship. And that's a testament to what human beings can do if they can hold fast to what they believe, but believe in other human beings. So it was very special. Martin was very special. And to honor him with your comment is just
great.
Right on.
And even talking about the media, just to follow up on that, is that Martin McGuinness also shook hands with the Queen. So, and that was on the media. And I think, and he got, a lot of criticism for that, but that probably was something that may not have been that easy for him to do, but it was something he felt he had to do. So that's another aspect of how he was a great leader.
Can I just connect this also to Bonnie's work on sectarianism? So again, what we're hearing is that there are affiliations, but they are greatly accentuated by expectations. The expectation is that the other side is going to be sectarian. I wanted, in light of what we're hearing of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, I want to get back to Tina Black's question of the under 25s. Bonnie, are you finding in your research any generational differences? Are you able to tap into younger voters in a way that you're actually seeing differences in the affiliation and in the expectation of the other side?
So that's part of the data that I have not uncovered yet. But something that is encouraging, there's two things that I wanted to say. Something that is encouraging is that it seems like in these experiments, if people are given true information about how the other side would vote, and it's not as bad, it's not as sectarian as they think it would be, that in subsequent choices in the experiment, that person moderates. So it seems as if talking to each other, having information, understanding each other better, that does something. And when you're talking about Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, it's talking about the importance of personal relationships across, really remarkable divides. Can you imagine Joe Biden and Trump, striking up a relationship it's remarkable what they were able to do. But those things happen, just not at that level. I had during COVID a thing that I called paramilitary book club. And it was I just decided to invite a bunch of the people that I work with online, and we would choose a book or a documentary or something. In fact, we read Peace Runner, and Bruce came in and was a guest speaker one Saturday evening for somebody from South Belfast and somebody from West Belfast and a couple other people. And by the end of the time that we had paramilitary book club meeting on a weekly basis, there was an incident in which somebody from Sandy Row had their car stolen, so very loyalist area of Belfast, and he had no hope that the car was going to be recovered because it turned out that it was spotted in Divis Flats, which is a very kind of fringe Republican area of Belfast. And it just so happened that one member of the paramilitary book club lived in Sandy Row and another lived near Divis. So they were able to recover the car, Unfortunately, the car was stolen a second time on his way to go pick it up in Divas, but ultimately they were able to finally. It's a very Belfast story, but I guess in the end, like these two guys formed a friendship that they still have to, like, given where they live and given their lives and everything. Like, there's, it can't be an all-out friendship, and they have to be careful about certain things. But like, there's a genuine camaraderie there, and this is across, them having like been in armed groups that were fighting each other violently in the past. So, I mean, remarkable things are possible when people just make human connections, and I think that Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley exemplified that.
I see over here. Yep.
Good evening. I just want to appreciate that the ambassador spoke about the police reform, because I believe when the Good Friday Agreement was being put together, that was a very, very big issue, and the fact that they even changed the name of the police department. But I'm not so sure how much it has changed, at least the feeling for people. And then the other part, second part of my question, I don't know if that was really a question, but this new law that England wants to pass as far as legacy, and that was also part of the Good Friday Agreement. And when you're talking about building trust in the nationalist community, that's a very, very big issue. Both the police and going back and looking at these cases. Thank you. Your comments.
Well, Fergal, I think that the legacy bill and the protocol bill are both violations of the principle of not unilateral action, and that they are symbolic of the Boris Johnson government and the way they approach these matters. And I don't think we should shy away from the truth about that. And the deterioration of the relationship between the UK and Ireland that occurred in that period is really one of the things that threatened the Good Friday Agreement and its vitality. I think Sunak has gone in the opposite direction, and we can hope that he'll scuttle the legacy bill the same way he settled the protocol situation. But, I mean, we need to call them out when they do this, and that's not the diplomatic thing to do, so I'm not asking you to do it, but I'm doing it. I think the policing, there's also been a deterioration in the affirmative action standard, in which the goal of equalizing Catholic and Protestant participation in the police was abandoned, and that's a mistake, and it should be changed.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I was U.S. Consul General when that was my big issue, is devolution of policing and justice, and the PSNI, and having, as Bruce mentioned, making sure that there were that the police in the communities represented the people who lived in the communities, and I think that may have fallen off a little bit. And I will tell you, I hosted an event in middle of March on St. Patrick's Day week, and we had unionists, nationalists, young people, and we had people represented from the British government, and Fergal was there for some of it, and unanimously, nobody from Northern Ireland wanted the legacy, supports the legacy. So it's not really a nationalist community issue, it's across the board, because there, I think, is many people who there are people on all sides who are either victims or had family members who were victims, and they don't like the legislation. So hopefully it won't get passed. That was put up. And the other thing, just as a part of that, that we discussed was the and this maybe has to do with healthcare and stuff, but the effects of the conflict, and even on young people. A person who works with young people talked to us about this, about suicide rates, substance abuse rates, alcoholism rates, that these are all higher than the norm in Northern Ireland, and a lot of it, is the legacy, not the legacy, we're talking about the legacy of the conflict, and not just people who are involved in the conflict, but, the next generation. So it's a concern.
Hi, my name is Risa Nestor. I graduated from the master's program here in 2018, and my question was also about the legacy bill, but I was wondering more if you see any sort of way forward that could work from a truth and reconciliation perspective, or if based on the time that's passed and the sort of general say nothing mentality that maybe there needs to be an entirely different strategy to bring closure to people.
I mean, we heard, I can just say, Bonnie was in that meeting with me, heard from the Secretary of State, not the current Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, but a previous one. That was kind of a reason for the legacy bill, is that if you allow cases to keep going forward, the legal system will be overwhelmed. That was their, I'll call it their talking point. But but that still doesn't satisfy the need for people, even if people don't get, maybe a lot of people who committed crimes are dead now or they're gone, but family members sometimes want to have some kind of a closure, and it may not be, the legal system. But we did, I've heard more than one person from the British government said, well, there's, we need to just kind of say, okay, we're done, and everything moves forward, and that isn't across the board what I've heard from the people in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think that one shouldn't believe the British talking points on the legacy bill.
Yeah.
They have all kinds of fancy words, but the truth is that the politics in the Tory party is to protect the police, and military who are involved in killings. And just like, why do we not know the Finucane story? How high up did somebody say, who will rid me of this troublesome attorney? And I have a theory about how high up that was. The point is that you are on to a real problem, which is 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement, and more years than that since most of these atrocities occurred. And what do you do about that? Well, the British answer is stall. And that's the wrong answer, because there's no reconciliation in stalling. There are victims groups, and they disagree about a lot of different things, but they are united on the answer that this is not the answer. So the hard work of mediating and exploring with victims groups how to deal with the reality that some things just will never be resolved, or these are very difficult, and calling on them to forge an answer and then running forward with their answer, rather than have the British government tell them what the answer is. And these people are capable of that, but they have never really been encouraged to do that very difficult thing of reaching across the divide and saying, well, how do we get from here to there, and what else do we need? So I think there's a lot of hope in that. These groups have been very organized in opposition to the legacy bill, so it's time for somebody to, say to them, okay, but now it falls to you. So everybody's looking to you. What is the answer? What is an answer you can agree on? That's going to be very difficult, but I bet there are mediators in the world who could help them do that. But that's where I would go to solve that problem. And, there's plenty of room for truth and reconciliation, but only if people are ready to participate. You can't force people into truth and reconciliation. They have to adopt it as something that's a positive for the community. So anyhow, that would be my suggestion.
So we'll take one more question from my left and one more question here. I also have a wrap-up question if we have time. We will also be continuing the conversation downstairs, but please, right here and then here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Linda Longmire. I'm professor of global studies at Hofstra University, and we've organized, in fact, I'm doing this primarily because nobody else was doing it out on the wilds of Long Island. But
That's where I grew up, the wilds of Long Island.
So I can say, well, then it's redeemed. But, but we're doing a symposium on April 27th that has 3 components. So it's so great to be among like-minded people who care about peace building in this way. But we'll do a panel. First, it was going to be, but they've kind of blurred the past and the present and the future, but looking at the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But then we're also, Susan, I was so delighted with what you said, because we're showing the film Waving Goodbye to Dinosaurs about the role of the Women's Coalition, which is so powerful, and there'll be a discussion, and I'm so excited for our students especially to see that. And then a closing panel. I've worked hard to try to reach across, so we have people coming from Scottish Studies in Canada, as well as Brian Doherty from Derry, who was involved in the police board. So hopefully it will all generate fruitful discussion. And then I'm, as always, excited to have my students who know very little, even Irish Americans in the community, know very little about all this history, unfortunately. So I'm taking 15 of my best Hofstra students to Derry for 3 weeks at the end of the semester. So I'm very excited for them to learn this about this important history, and then also to try to distill the lessons for other places in the world as well. Back in 2001, we had George Mitchell at Hofstra to do a keynote address about, and that was one of the things everyone wanted to know, can the lessons be learned here that can be applied elsewhere? And so that's another learning experience, teachable moment that we're looking forward to. But in any case, I'm delighted to be here, and anyone and everyone is welcome to please come and share your experience and your insights and your ideas about this next step. You know, that the Good Friday Agreement may have been the necessary condition, but, you know, it's not sufficient, as I think we all agree.
Thank you, Linda. I'm delighted.
I ask a very quick
yes,
question.
we have a question here, and then one last question here. Yes, great to see you in person, Linda. Welcome to Ireland House. Yes. Yeah.
Good evening, and first of all, can I just say fair play to the ambassador for wearing a suit and a tie in this 30-degree weather. He's a braver man than I am, and to everybody else who's wearing a full suit. There's a lot mentioned about the Good Friday generation, and rightly so, but I often think that what is missing as a follow-on remark is, what about the Good Friday generation for those in Ireland and Irish citizens, as well myself, particularly under the age of 30? And, you know, I think, my question here is, I wonder how helpful the conversation turning away from the practicalities and implementation of either steady government or just government in general in the north of Ireland, you know, rather than obsessing about a united Ireland. And the reason I ask, is that helpful, is for 2 or 3 very quick anecdotes. I do promise it is quick. The first of all is a friend of mine from Templenoe. I'm from Kenmare. A friend of mine from Templenoe was a principal private secretary in the north of Ireland, or the Northern Ireland office. And the permanent secretary of the Northern Ireland office is a guy from Skibbereen. And of course, he was so effective in negotiations with those in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Didn't Simon Coveney ask him at one point, why didn't he come work for us? To which he was told, you denied me twice. The second part is, you know, I was at the rugby a couple of years back, always England-Ireland, as would be the case for Ireland-England in reverse years, and being at one of the private clubs in Dublin, a group from the north supporting Ireland said, we wouldn't mind being part of Ireland, sure they have the lovely hotels and great restaurants, Dublin is a great place to go. And of course, I was working in London at the time, and a very close friend of mine, she'd be of a working class Protestant background, and she said, she's from Ballymena, I believe, she said, you know, we're in fear of United Ireland. I said, don't worry, lots of people in Ireland wouldn't let that happen. The last thing you want would be you guys. You don't even have a sing-song at the end of a wedding. And the third part, I say, and I'm somewhat jovial in these remarks, but all of it adds up to a broader point in a second, I promise. A very well-educated English friend of mine said, oh, you guys are still part of the United Kingdom down in Ireland, right? I said, well, no, in Ireland we are our own independent country, courtesy of, you know, independence since 1922. This was 2022. And they hadn't quite gotten the subtleties of it. So, in terms of all those 3 strands of different views, different points of view, and I suppose probably a lack of understanding, and in particular going back to my original point, the generation those in Ireland don't view the fact that, okay, if they're throwing bombs in Derry of a Tuesday and welcoming a president of a Wednesday, do you really want to import that problem into Ireland? And having that discussion either via the United Ireland Initiative, the Shared Ireland Initiative, my apologies, Ambassador, the Shared Ireland Initiative, for which it's a valuable discussion, or a Sinn Féin and Republican-led, courtesy of a lot of donations out of the US, which is objectively the case, a somewhat funded agenda, and with that, a perhaps rewriting of history, and you see that in Ireland, Sinn Féin claiming that they are now part of the original 1922 history rather than 1972 history. So there's a lot in there, but my point is 68% of Irish people don't want to change their flag or their anthem when it comes to United Ireland, though they're generally in favour of the idea. Given it's a much more contentious issue at the North, is it not more helpful to continue with the status quo and focus on getting involved in the nitty-gritty and the day-to-day before broader initiatives and conversations are had?
So a long and important question. It'll demand a relatively short answer, just given our time frame, if anybody wants to comment.
Those are very good and prescient points. The question of the future constitutional status of Northern Ireland is a political question, initially for the people of Northern Ireland and then for the people of the Republic if they were to choose a united Ireland. I think people shouldn't tell people not to advocate a united Ireland, which many people have a habit of doing. Because they think it's premature, or they think it's impractical, or they think some other group of people will be offended, or some other group of people don't support it. People who have a political view about the constitutional future of Northern Ireland should go into politics and should fight these issues politically and argue them out. And the one thing that is not happening is the unionist community, through its political representatives, is refusing to engage in this conversation. And it is one of the choices. And if they think it's a bad choice, they should be out in the public, not just in their own halls, but out in the public, convincing other people in Northern Ireland it's a bad idea and why. And if you're a unionist and you believe that people should not want to leave the United Kingdom, you would work a lot harder on the quality of life in Northern Ireland than on screwing around with the protocol. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they don't sort of causes skepticism that what they really care about is the people of Northern Ireland, as what they care about is what's going on at Westminster. So I think you make some very good points, but those points need to be in the political process, and they need to be open and debated. This is what the Good Friday Agreement did. It said this question is for politics. This question is not for war. And people who were at war did that deal, along with people who were not at war, and said, this is a democratic question. So people have no business not engaging in that politics, even if it's uncomfortable and it means telling people you would otherwise not like to argue with that they're wrong, or that they should modify their view, or they should slow down the train, or whatever there is. This is a conversation that should happen, because that vote is going to come sooner or later. So how that vote comes and what its consequences are, that's for politics.
Bonnie, did you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, there are people who describe themselves as unionists that are trying to have these conversations, or even loyalists that are trying to have these conversations. But the problem with the leadership of political unionism is such that they're starting to have these conversations under the banner of like civic unionism, and trying to cobble together the resources and arguments to put forth the idea that isn't it better in the UK. And so these are conversations that are worthwhile to have. I mean, one of the inspirations for trying to figure out the extent to which people are looking for more unifying politics in the North is the sense that I had after going to Derry for years and years and years and seeing that nothing had changed. It did not look any different after years and years and years of going there. And that felt like, well, isn't that's kind of indicative of a problem, right? And shouldn't stuff, like the people that I spent a lot of time with in Derry were hardcore Republicans. And at the same time, they really wanted life to be better for them now. And so, I mean, I think as an outside observer, many of us as interested outside observers might have the sense, I hear it from you as well, maybe a priority in terms of, in tandem, right? So it's equally valid to say, I care about the constitutional question, but it's also valid to say, we want life to be better for people in the North right now. How can we make that happen? Because you're right, it's that people in the South are going to find questions of reunion, United Ireland problematic unless those questions are addressed and sorted out. Yeah, nobody wants like sort of an East-West Germany kind of, anxious situation about how would this go?
We'll take one question here, and
Just
perhaps
very
Susan,
quick.
if you want to come in.
So I was in Belfast in 2019. I went on the walking tour, the political walking tour, where you had a Catholic on one side and a Protestant on another side, and he introduced himself, the Protestant did, as English. And I said, English? I would assume that you would say Anglo-Irish or something like that. And he was very firm and pointed to the mural of the Queen and said, until everyone recognizes her as the leader. But what I'm concerned about, so that the gates are still there, they still close at 7 p.m. or 10 p.m. The murals depict violence. So you have children walking to school, seeing these murals. So what would you do about the murals and the gates?
I mean, I think that's a good question because the murals are part of a history or a shared history. So are you going to just, whitewash them? So that's a really good question. And I do think, it goes back to, I think we've discussed education, but even, if you walk by those murals and you go to a school where you don't really hear any differing points of view, that everybody's kind of on the same wavelength, there's no hearing, one side or the other, then I don't think it will be difficult for things to change. I think, having education, and if you talk about integrated education with people in Northern Ireland, that's like the third, they're the two schools, and then integrated is kind of like the third, instead of thinking about, okay, we're going to get rid of the Catholic and the state schools and put everything, together so things are together. But I think that would help a way forward is, to improve education. And even going back to the other question, the other thing I would say is, like if you really look at, like for me, I work for the U.S. government. I'm not Irish American. So I don't really care if Ireland is reunited or if they stay with the United Kingdom. I just think that the people need to decide what's best for them. But if you look at, what Bonnie said, and even talking about that things aren't working, I mean, the status of healthcare, schools and a lot of things are not working, and that's really, I don't think you can put that on the Irish or British government, but you have to put it on, I think Bruce mentioned, political unionism. Why aren't we, if you want me to want to stay in the United Kingdom, then show me why this is the best way. And if nothing ever changes, as Bonnie said in Derry, how is that the best way? I think this is my personal opinion. People may differ, but to me, the Sinn Féin changing kind of the rhetoric. If you talk to Mary Lou McDonald or Michelle O'Neill, they talk about kinds of social issues that people want to hear about. How would we? I hope that the people of the United Kingdom have learned a lesson, that before you'd have a referendum, you'd have to have figured out what's going to happen to pensions, what's going to happen to the NHS, what's going to happen to education, and on both sides of the border. So those are all things that I think people should be talking about, and I do think the political parties that do that, in my opinion, will be more successful in the future in getting whatever it is they want to achieve, whether it's staying in the United Kingdom or having united Ireland.
There is, your point about the peace walls, so-called, is really sort of gets at it. That is, and peace walls are supported by local communities that have them. There are more of them now than there were when the Good Friday Agreement was agreed to. So it's a problem. And so on one level, Northern Ireland is at least as sectarian now as it was in 1998. You could take that as a glass half empty. On the other hand, a lot of polling data, including work that Bonnie referred to, suggests that the average person is way ahead of the political leadership on these questions and is much more focused on the here and now. And if sectarianism is standing in the way of the health service or education, are much more open to changing things than the political leadership. So in one sense, the growth of alliance votes in recent years, that are returning to a place they were many, many years ago, is an indication that there's a middle ground on these questions that needs, that is finding some expression and has to find expression, which doesn't mean that people can't be middle ground and be for United Ireland or be middle ground and be for the United Kingdom. It means that most people can't eat the constitutional question, and they really need to eat every day. Yeah. And so that politics is the question. I mean, the solution to politics is when it's relevant to the people. When politics is relevant to the people, they participate. When it's irrelevant, they drop out. We got a dropout problem in Northern Ireland on that right now. So anything people can do to raise up the grassroots and have a voice in the political process, I think, is the solution to what you're talking about. It's not gonna be dictated from above.
So we've gone on much longer than anticipated, and yet when I look out at the faces, I have a sense, for the most part, that we could go on even longer. We're not going to.
They're going to groan now.
Conversation downstairs. I want to wrap up just with the briefest of questions, or at least the briefest of answers to my question. Talking to a friend at the New York Times, a reporter today, and he's also a historian, and the question he was fielding was, why was Good Friday chosen as the date of the agreement? He's far too good a historian to know that of course he knows it wasn't chosen because this came down to the wire. It wasn't clear that there would be an agreement. So there were tactics. Before tactics, there was strategy, and that takes us back to Bruce's presentation at the beginning of the evening. Recently read Fergal Cochrane's book, A Fragile Peace, A History of Northern Ireland in the 20th Century, and that title, A Fragile Peace, of course sticks in my mind. Could I ask you, as we wrap up, really just in one word, one concept, or at most one sentence, if we look now at retaining what's been built, what's the most important thing to you? What's the most important consideration? So many words have come up this evening: education, politics, strategy. I just wonder if we could, if we look to the future and look to the sustainability of peace.
I mean, one word could be cooperation, or even if you make maybe compromise is better, because sometimes compromise is seen as a weakness or negative. Like if I agree, we each give a little bit, and that is how we got the Good Friday Agreement, is everybody gave in a little bit, gave up something, and that's, I think, how it's going to, be able to continue. So I'll call it compromise, not cooperation. A little of both would be good, but anyway.
You got to end the dysfunction of devolved government, and without that, there is no democracy. And to do that, you have to take away the structural veto that exists by people being able to say no and cause others not to be able to act. And that is much less dramatic than many other things. Every other office in Northern Ireland is on the Dahan system, and if you pass, the next party gets the shot. Just change the First Minister and Deputy First Minister to that, and I promise you, neither Sinn Féin nor DUP will pass.
And Bonnie, not to put you
I
on the
agree.
spot.
I mean, I do think that you can solve the problem with engagement, structural changes, or leadership. They all relate to each other, and often require each other. But it seems like all of those are maybe could be they're kind of lacking right now. Something has to give. People have to get more engaged and demand more from their politicians, not leave it to people. I mean, 70% of parents want integration, integrated education, and only about 7% of children, officially at least, go to integrated schools. That's, I mean, the disconnect between what people want and what politicians provide is really striking. So leadership, in the absence of leadership on certain issues, then you could turn to structural changes like some of the small ones that Bruce has suggested. So there's different ways out of it, I guess. There's different ways out of this moment that feels maybe a bit stagnant in a time when we like to celebrate the promise of peace.
So Loretta, Ambassador Mythen, Congressman, Ambassador and Dr. Bonnie Weir, thank you so much for a wonderful evening.